So welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Kitty Douglas, and I'm delighted to host today's discussion with Lauren Groh-Wargo. At Big Tent USA, we put democracy above partisanship. We are a national women-led voter coalition dedicated to protecting democracy, women's reproductive freedom, and our children and grandchildren's future through education and civic engagement. And speaking of civic engagement, we have a lot going on our website. I'm going to turn our letter writing effort over to Bree Glover, who's going to give you an update. Bree, it's all yours.
Hello, everyone. My name is Bree. Normally behind the scenes here at Big Tent, helping with running the events. But most importantly, I'm helping with our letter writing campaigns. So we are chugging along. We have a very lofty but very doable goal of sending 100,000 letters out within our Big Tent community. We're over 20,000 right now, and we have a lot of great momentum. But we just wanted to let everyone know, if you want something tangible to do to help our democracy that's proven to work, please consider writing letters with us. We have Get Out the Vote letters through Vote Writers, through Vote Forward, and we have voter ID and registration letters through Vote Writers. I'm very excited for today's conversation.
Lauren Groh-Wargo is returning to Big Tent. She's a top political democracy and civic engagement strategist, executive, and fighter for economic justice. In 2012, Lauren began a partnership with Stacey Abrams to chart and then execute a 10-year plan to build power and policy and wins for Georgia through supporting existing and building new civic engagement infrastructure. Spurred by wide-scale voter suppression during the 2018 election, Lauren founded and is CEO of Fair Fight Action, which focuses on fighting voter suppression and advancing voting rights. Fair Fight Action brings the full force of strategic campaign tactics and culturally relevant engagement and voter education to those most targeted by suppression and disinformation. Fair Fight played a leading national and battleground state role in the 2020 election and in the 2021 Georgia runoff. Lauren, thank you so much for coming back to Big Tent.
Thank you so much for having me, Kitty. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Lauren Groh-Wargo. I grew up in Cleveland. I live in Atlanta almost 10 years, but I'm coming to you today from beautiful, sunny Savannah. And when we were talking about coming back to Big Tent, first I was going to be here with Dr. Carol Anderson. She's on our board. She's an incredible friend and expert historian on how race and elections and voter suppression has worked in our country. Unfortunately, like Kitty said, she can't be here today, so you're only going to get me, but I'm going to give you some resources if you want to learn more on her valuable perspective, and I will share some of the nuggets that I like to share of hers as well. So the question I get asked the most right now, overall, is Georgia competitive? And so as we think about that, and before we start, I have a slideshow for you all. Before we start that, Eva, I want to remind people where we were 4 years ago. 4 years ago, we were finishing up primaries and in COVID, and we had those disastrous primaries in Wisconsin and elsewhere. And it was becoming clear that Biden was going to be our nominee. And so part of the inside scoop on what happened there is 4 years ago, the presidential campaigns and then eventually the Biden campaign were not planning to fully target Georgia. If y'all remember this, they had this like tier 2 kind of like Georgia, Texas maybe thing going on. So what we ended up doing is myself and Stacey Abrams, the co-founder of Fair Fight, went through a series of meetings with the top brass of the Biden campaign to negotiate their engagement in the state and to negotiate a real budget, not to Fair Fight, but for to negotiate a real campaign and their budget, a media budget and full staffing in Georgia, which they did do. And it was in part because they really wanted, all the support and all the surrogacy work. So that happened 4 years ago. And so it's funny to me that today people ask me, is Georgia real? When I can tell you full stop that both sides of the aisle are spending in Atlanta, which is among the top 10 most expensive media markets in the nation. So if you see spending in the metro Atlanta markets, radio, TV, then that means the campaign's targeting the state. because you can't just go spend those millions of dollars. It's very expensive. We are seeing advertising from both the Biden campaign, the Trump campaign, and a full court press on media and a fully targeted state on both sides of the aisle. So this is the first time since the 1990s that we are really considered not a tier 2, but are in the top tier for 270. And with that, we'll start the slideshow and we will go from there. So if we go to the second slide, the way to understand what's happening in Georgia and around the nation, but particularly informed by what happened in Georgia 4 years ago, every single thing in Georgia that is happening on the anti-voting, on the right-wing side, is about the 11,779 votes that Trump lost by. And once you think about that and put that top of mind, everything happening starts to make sense. And since we were the closest losing margin for Trump, it starts to make sense on how the anti-voting world is thinking about their work nationally as well. And so you can keep clicking through, Eva. And so we see today an effort to shave the margin and to create the conditions to contest the results. Obviously, we're the only battleground state with the Trump accountability trial. And on top of it, that trial is about the former president's attempt to overturn the results, the famous phone call. So when you look at everything happening on the chilling participation side, challenging voter side, voter suppression side, before the election, all of it has a direct through line to trying to create the conditions to question and overturn the results successfully this time afterwards. And the two areas that are so specific and clear that I'm going to focus on in this conversation and then talk a little bit about how we're fighting back are on the changed rules on provisional votes and on mass voter purges, otherwise known as mass challenges. If you were on with me and Mark Elias a couple weeks ago, we talked a little bit about this, and targeting our most vulnerable American citizens, homeless folks, specifically. So we're going to dive in on all of this. So you can skip through the next slide. Well, quickly, these are the top battleground states. Go back real quick, Eva. They're little, but you can see these are the top pathways to 270. As you know, the Biden campaign and Trump campaign also are doing some activities in places like Minnesota, Virginia, Maine. But in terms of the core pathway to 270, Georgia is on that list. And so the short version of it, the answer is yes, absolutely, we are competitive. Next slide. So then going back 4 years ago, in that very small, less than 12,000 margin after the recounts and all of the fighting, in 2020, over 20,000 Georgians who are disproportionately Black, they're majority Black, voted by provisional ballot in the 2020 and 2021 runoff elections. Biden, in the general in 2020, took 64% of those provisional ballots and won by 11,000 votes. Another way to say this is that folks who showed up on election day to a precinct that they weren't assigned to, right? During early vote in person, you can vote anywhere in your county. On election day, you have to vote in your assigned precinct. And it was something like 12,000 voters voted on election day, not in their assigned precincts. They were given a provisional ballot. They voted that provisional ballot, and those provisional ballots were counted for the statewide races, not for anything districted, right? They might have accidentally voted out of their district, but their votes for president and Senate were counted. They're called out of precinct provisional ballots. They were 65% Democratic, mostly Black voters, and constituted over half of Biden's margins. Similarly, in the 2021 runoffs, bigger margin, but there were substantive numbers if you're looking at a marginal race on how many provisionals were cast and then counted. All right. So that was one of the most clear attacks when Kemp in 2021 championed his infamous voter suppression bill, SB 202. It got rid of counting provisionals voted out of precinct. It bans out of precinct voting tells you got to go find your precinct. We're not going to count that provisional ballot. And so it fundamentally shifted and was a direct shot at that 11,000 and change margin because it was so impactful to the final numbers. Then on the right side here, it's pretty little, but the point is less the detail and more the overall point, which is that currently in Fulton County, our largest county in the state, there's over 7,000 voters registered to homeless shelters. Lauren, why does this matter? Well, this year in 2024, the MAGA folks and Kemp put forward and signed a bill that says homeless voters and doesn't define it, uses the term homeless voters, but does not define what that means, and says that homeless voters have to be registered at the county registrar office. They have to get their election mail there. It's this confusing part of the statute that makes no sense and is undefined. So we started to look to see what kind of impact that was. Because obviously homeless folks are registered at the place they last lived. Maybe they're registered at a temporary shelter, et cetera, et cetera. Right now, there's this confusing new language that they need to be registered at their county registrar. Well, I don't need to tell y'all, the downtown registration office is not convenient to get to for most people. So what does that even mean? They're not used to receiving mail. It's a very confusing new provision. And when you put it together with the out of precinct voting, in terms of what precinct you're assigned to, it appears to be an attempt to disenfranchise homeless folks. Because if they're not voting in their assigned precinct, they're supposed to be registered downtown, but that's not where they vote because they live somewhere else, or maybe they are registered somewhere else. It's just very confusing. And I know you guys are going to have questions, and I'm going to say, yes, you are right. It's confusing. But the point is, when you are looking at this kind of margin and you're the other side of anti-voting folks looking at how you can impact it, you're starting to go shave the margins, punch down on the most vulnerable people in the state. Next slide. So we know it is a great article. Maybe Eva can put it in the chat for everybody. Fair Fight worked with ProPublica last year to really drill down into this issue. And this article talks about how 6 MAGA activists have been leading the charge the past couple of years on these mass voter purges, mass voter challenges, and how they've been focused on homeless folks. And if you read this article, it will then feed into the change in the law this year that further focuses on homeless folks. That 7,400 or so folks that we were able to find registered to shelters, you want to think, what percent African-American do you think that list is? Somebody put in the chat. What's your off the cuff guess? 75% Black. So these goes to what Dr. Carol Anderson refers to as all of these laws and practices that are racially neutral in language, but racially targeted in real life. Next slide. So when you combine together what Kemp and MAGA folks did in the aftermath of the runoff that Ossoff and Warnock won, combined with what they put forward this year in the gear up to Trump v. Biden 2.0, taken together, this is very aggressive voter suppression. Y'all remember, maybe you saw Larry David and his hilarious curb on how SB 202 bans handing water out to voters in line, bans line warming, a practice that we all did, reduced drop boxes, made it easier to do the mass voter purges that True the Vote and others had done, shortened vote by mail, and then it banned out of precinct voting, essentially. And then combined now with the new law that just was passed a couple of weeks ago, removing QR codes from ballots, putting on really significant unfunded mandates on processing, burdening elections administrators, and then continuing to open more pathways for vigilantes to kick voters off the rolls via mass challenges or mass purges, and then these confusing and disenfranchising new rules for homeless voters. You can only understand all of this when you think back to that 11,700 votes. Kemp's quote in 2021 was, "I didn't like the results either. That's why I did something about it." And then him and the MAGA crew took a step further to change rules again in the lead up to this election. SB 189's effective date is July 1, 2024. So these election administrators and others have new rules, voters have new rules, putting into effect just months before early voting. And the next slide, again, don't worry about it too much. We're about to make this public and we'll get it to Big Tent to share around. It's going to be on our social media. I asked our team to create a flow chart on how these mass voter challenges are supposed to work. And this is where a local activist in a county can bring to the Board of Elections a list of voters, and they're supposed to come with evidence on why they shouldn't be on the rolls. True the Vote did this. Some of you may remember they challenged 380,000 voters after Biden won and before the 2021 runoff in that short period. And since then, that has, fair fight. We actually sued True the Vote. We still have them in court with Mark Elias and our local crew. But the laws have become more and more permissive. But it's also extremely confusing. It's confusing to the Board of Election members. It's confusing to voters. But there's this whole system. Once folks are challenged locally and the list of voters are brought, that they're supposed to happen, including mailing. Ultimately, if the challenges are approved by the board, mailing a letter to the voter to say you have been challenged and that you need to appear at a hearing and that the process to remove you from the rolls has begun. And so our mission is, and what we do is every time those challenge letters go out, we contact voters as well for them to know their rights. And then we work our darndest to ensure that the challenges are stopped before they even get to the voters. And so far this year, most challenges have been rejected by the boards of elections for not having enough evidence, but they're continuing to come. And to give you a sense of scope and scale that we're dealing with, the next slide shows since SB 202 was passed in 2021, and we saw this become the voter suppression du jour of the right-wing anti-voting ecosystem, we are seeing just huge numbers of voters being challenged. And when I say 1 in 13 voters in our very large, most diverse county, Gwinnett, have been challenged, it doesn't mean that 1 in 13 voters have actually gotten the challenge letter saying they're being kicked off the rolls. It's from our analysis of the data. It's all public data. When they bring a list to get challenged, we analyze the data. So we know already, since the last presidential and since SB 202, this is an attempt to change the voter rolls, intimidate voters, and shave the results. Death by a million cuts. There's no statewide database that you can go get this challenge list when they've been submitted. It's organizing county by county, fighting county by county. Sometimes it's 800 mass challenges. Sometimes it's 46 mass challenges. Sometimes it's 1,200 mass challenges. And then we've seen previously instances where it's 10,000, 15,000 at a time. And that's what we're preparing for. And then the data we analyze on all of these, consistently the challenges, whatever community they're targeting, are disproportionately Black voters, disproportionately Asian American and Latino voters, lots of college students and young people. They just challenged in Macon, Bibb County, a whole bunch of students at Mercer, challenged a lot of people at PO boxes, that kind of thing. And so they are disproportionately targeting Democratic-leaning voters. Next slide. And we know from talking to voters how intimidating it is to get that letter, to try to go through this hearing process. We have collected hundreds of stories from voters who have been challenged. Some of them are part of our litigation against True the Vote. This gentleman was a retired Army veteran who was challenged. He said it invoked PTSD. He said it was like he was being criminalized for just trying to vote, and said it felt incredibly racially and politically motivated. So we've gotten these stories, and it's just very intimidating. And I think he's such a painful and powerful example. He's a military veteran. This is not a man who you would think would be easily intimidating, but the shame and intimidation impacts of this around voting and making it feel like you did something wrong is part of the point, right? And so our mission is to inoculate against these strategies, get ahead of them, and then support voters along the way so that they're able to cast their vote and have it counted. Next slide. As we then tie in, this was going to be where Dr. Anderson was going to help me, but as we look at these tactics today, what is so jarring is how they are direct echoes of our racist Jim Crow history in the South and in America. A couple months ago, I was sitting in the state Senate hearing when they were discussing the latest voter suppression bill. And MAGA Republican after MAGA Republican was taking the mic and talking about how they had to clean the voter rolls. We have a whole transcript. All the times they talk about cleaning the voter rolls, cleansing the voter rolls of undesirables, homeless folks, right? Essentially. So they always use this race neutral language. That language is exactly the same language from the genesis of these mass voter challenges. Mass voter challenges started in Georgia in the 1940s when Black World War II veterans were coming home and had been more fully enfranchised. And so the white conservative power structure started organizing vigilante brigades to challenge those voters individually and en masse at the polls and before voting. That's where it started. And they used the same language as the MAGA anti-votes of today, cleansing the voter rolls. And these brigades of folks and vigilantes, they proudly use that term, challenging Black voters. Next slide. And we know this lie of voter fraud, this lie and this anti-American, anti-patriotic, anti-democratic idea that somehow we've got to cleanse the voter rolls of all these undesirables is always heightened in moments of demographic change. That's the story of our country. And today in Georgia, we are likely have hit a demographic inflection point. According to the 2020 census, Georgia was just under 52% white. And as we know the population trends are going, we believe Georgia right around now, 2024, 2025, is majority people of color. Whites have moved into the minority. And then the voter file lags, obviously, population. And so we expect it'll take a couple more years at least for the voter file to be minority white. But this is a massive shift. If you're a conservative, largely white minority, and you look at the population trends around you, they believe they're on a patriotic mission to preserve America in their view as this demography has changed. That's the sort of language. Next slide. And so mass challenges are now moving all over the nation. The grifter anti-voting organizations are using this to raise money. There's a whole slew of organizations that are putting out press releases and blast emails about all their work to cleanse the voter rolls in all kinds of states from undesirables. There's a whole massive disinformation and legislative effort by the far right to ban non-citizen voting. We saw it in state legislative chambers across the country this winter and spring, and moving in Congress as well. Non-citizens cannot vote in federal elections. There need not be a slew of new laws or discussion, right? But this is a fear-mongering, divisive tactic to try to distract us and to try to bring this farcical notion of voter fraud up into the zeitgeist as a real thing. And that's why you're seeing more mass challenges moving all over the nation. Next slide. And so all of this is coming in the context of the RNC filing a lot of proactive litigation, trying to curtail access all over the country, suits in Arizona, Pennsylvania, and many others. And then their plan to have their anti-voting folks, monitoring drop boxes in all the boards of election meetings. Their folks like to go to board of election meetings when they're talking about the early vote plan. And if people stand up in the meeting to advocate for more early voting, they like to take pictures of them and try to intimidate them and not have them advocates. Any pro-voting advocacy happening right now in our country and in battlegrounds is being sort of tracked and threatened by the other side. At the same time, there are so many opportunities for folks to come and help and to drown them out because they are a small, very loud minority of majority, very pro-voter folks in these spaces. So that's our mission, is to prepare for all of this, but to gird our supporters and the pro-voter activists to go into this to advocate and to support voters. Next slide. This is our country's history. And if you haven't read Dr. Anderson's book, One Person, No Vote, the history and recent history of voter suppression, it's a great book to get up to speed on this. And she ties together how historically this lie of voter fraud, that all these undesirables were voting. In real life, we know we have work to do just to get people to exercise their right. We're not really worried about double voting and voting all over the nation. That's not actually the issue. The lie of voter fraud combined with the demographic threats has led to this sort of race neutral, racially targeted policy attacks. And Dr. Anderson calls it policy violence. And that's what we're seeing really at a new height in our country, drawing from the tactics of yore, but using new data and tools to do it. So that is all very negative, but I would go to the next slide and pivoting to the positive. So They wouldn't be doing all of this if they didn't think Georgia was competitive. Okay. Yes, we are competitive. So that's just brass tacks on politics. We're competitive now. We're competitive in the future. There's Senate races, down ballot races, lots going on in the state. And we know that as our state becomes more and more diverse, or as our country becomes more and more diverse, that we're going to see more and more of these suppression tactics and abuses of power, that we need to understand the history and the context on how we fight back and empower voters. So our work is to say, if your vote didn't matter, if your vote wasn't powerful, they wouldn't be trying so hard to suppress it, and helping organize a positive backlash to all this intimidation tactics, and then helping facilitate voter by voter, BOE by BOE, supporting access and supporting the right to vote, and organizing around these when they do it. We were able to thwart most of those huge True the Vote challenges in 2021 runoff, and we're organizing with our allies to thwart these challenges again and to advocate for voters. And we're going to be rolling out a whole great set of tools in June to support voters in the language they speak, to make sure they get the resources they need, get ahead of all of these challenges, working with the media and others to make sure people really understand it, so that we can then show as we go into the fall that their tactics are craven and corrupt, and that people want access to the vote. They want forward momentum in our country, and we need to shore up this fundamental right so then we can get to the policies we need, like access to abortion care, healthcare, affordable housing, and so many other reasons that we're all in this fight. So with that, we can pull off the slideshow, and Kitty, I will pass the mic back to you.
Great. Thank you, Lauren. A lot to process and think about. It is very enraging that this is how our certain state governments respond to an election where more people voted than ever before, even in the face of a pandemic. So let's just go into some questions in the chat, and then we can broaden them out. But my friend Beryl wanted to know, in terms of the homeless voters who are being targeted by that law, how many of them are veterans? And you did talk about one veteran in particular, but you said 75% are Black, but how many are veterans? Because that would seem extremely pernicious to throw people off or not let them vote, and they've served our country.
Yeah, I don't have the data on that specifically, but I can tell you that we are working with homeless advocates right now to get ready for this implementation deadline of July 1, and any confusing messages that are put out, and then the challenges that I expect. Because what you see in a mass challenge is, it could be perfectly possible for a challenger to pull data off the voter file and just challenge all the voters registered at a homeless center, right? So we're getting ahead and getting ready for that. And then we're working with some of our allies to talk about how some of our allies that do voter registration and who do voter registration drives, how we can support them on making sure the homeless and sort of transient housing community re-registers, make sure they have the most up-to-date registration, that they have thought through their plan to vote. And there's lots of ways we can do that outreach that's quite organized and nonpartisan, and really wonderful to support. So for those of you who are interested in that, get involved with Fair Fight. You can financially support that work. And then I did see a question in the chat that I could preemptively do, Kitty, if you want, which is how do folks help outside of Georgia? So one of the ways folks help outside of Georgia, if you go to fairfight.com and you sign up to become a volunteer, one of the areas for more dedicated volunteers, not casual volunteers, that if you have more time, we can run you through a process with the team to help us collect voter stories. And you can do that from anywhere in the nation, and we train you on how to do that. It takes more time. We do training and vetting and do all kinds of things to get you to that place. But we've had a set of national volunteers who have collected the stories of voters who've been challenged or had other issues. We have a very organized way that happens. And those stories are crucial and powerful. We move them to the media. They sometimes have become part of litigation, but to give a face to this issue is so important. So if you're interested in that, you can send eva@fairfightaction.com an email if you're specifically interested in giving it significant time. And then you can always sign up to volunteer at our website. But Eva, if you could put your email in. So talking to voters and getting their story, we have a lot of different kinds of people I have a lot of retired lawyers who love doing that for us around the country. You absolutely do not need to be a lawyer. But if you have time, that's one of the great ways. And then if you're a more casual volunteer, we do all kinds of rapid response drive and others, and we'll be working to make sure we're recruiting poll workers all over the nation later this summer. And there'll be all kinds of ways, no matter where you live, you can be involved in those fights to support the functioning of our democracy locally.
Oh, that's great. We really appreciate it because we have a very our audience wants to activate for sure. So I was going to get into some ballot curing, but I'm going to wait on that. And can you talk to us about the money behind True the Vote? Is it the same as the money? If I remember correctly, it was the Heritage Action Fund that wrote and paid for SB 202 and other laws. Is this the same group that's sort of funding True the Vote? Because all of this has to cost a lot of money, both the challenge and what you guys are doing to counter it, and for all these election boards, I'm assuming.
Yeah, I mean, so a couple different things on the money. The other thing that I didn't put up on SB 202, it banned private philanthropic dollars supporting election administration. Many of you will remember that in 2020, I mean, it was an election administration crisis. There was a big push to get federal dollars to help pay for elections and more vote by mail. And that did not pass Congress. And ultimately, there was a massive philanthropic effort to just help fund the running of our elections. And there was many millions of dollars in Georgia, but in most states. And the response to that was to ban that. So in 2021, Georgia and many other states run by voter suppressors said, no, we don't want to do that. But they continue to pass unfunded mandates on them. SB 202 is full of them, SB 189. There are some new processing guidelines that are incredibly onerous in Georgia and are all based in conspiracy theories and unnecessary, for example. So they are really putting an untenable situation for most of these counties. And so the counties are really trying to figure out how to do it. So that's one part of the money that's very concerning. Another part of the money, to your point, Kitty, is it's like the grifter voter suppression industrial complex through all of the right-wing funding networks. You can think of like the Leonard Leos, who have been part of funding the Federalist Society and the Supreme Court takeover. They have ties in, and their funding networks have ties in to the voter suppressive architecture. You can think about obviously, and the connection there to Heritage. Heritage was very active again in our Georgia legislative session. One of the very problematic characters in the show is Burt Jones. Many of you may remember, if you're really in the weeds, he's one of our unindicted fake electors here, election and conspiracies. He is our lieutenant governor and actually runs our state senate. It was very clear through the process that both he and True the Vote and Heritage were working closely with his Senate committee, that this was a huge priority to get this done. Overall, this is the same Lieutenant Governor MAGA person who set up this committee to investigate Bonnie Willis. It's an unprecedented committee with subpoena power. If anybody caught Rachel Maddow this week, she did a great overview of the right-wing efforts locally in Georgia and all the way federally to go after her. And all of those efforts are also tied in. And when you look at the legal and funding and organizational community. So as Hillary Clinton once said, yes, it is a vast right-wing conspiracy. That is real. And the money to push back is significant, right? So I'll give you a couple examples on some of how we deal with this. So in the 380,000 True the Vote challenge, that was across, I can't remember how many counties, 24 counties, 10,000 here, 5,000 here, 20,000 here. So it's a mass mobilization of us and all of our allies to get people into those boards elections to advocate for voters. And then the counties that did mail challenge letters to voters, then we're mailing challenge letters. We're mailing pro-voter letters so that people, so it's a mail program, right? Like, what does it cost to do this? Well, it's a mail program. It's an organizing program. It's a digital program. We've done radio ads. When they start really targeting certain communities, certain ethnic communities and others, we will do broader advertising and say, here's a hotline you can call for help. We have done things in language. Our second most spoken language is Spanish. Our third most spoken language in Georgia is Korean. And then we have a really diverse, it goes from there. So all of our resources are multilingual. And then we partner with a set of organizations to do this work in a culturally competent way. So it is significant. It's hundreds and hundreds of thousands of dollars to run just the pushback on mass voter challenges. And the reality is that it's so crucial to do so, right? Because what we know is we want to stop them from being processed to the extent possible, to the extent that can be influenced. And then we want to mitigate it once they go out. Because what are they trying to do? It's not a hard thought experiment to think about what this is actually about. What this is actually about is they want to be able to say post-election, if it's another close margin, or even if it's not a close margin, because they don't care, but if it's a close margin, they want to be able to say tens of thousands of challenged fraudulent voters. We tried to challenge them, but you blocked them, or we challenged them, but they voted, right? They want to be able to raise a set of arguments post-election in a way that will work better than it did last time for them, right? That's what this is about. And it goes back to this fundamental lie of voter fraud and a demographic threat. So that's what this is about, which is also why this tactic of mass voter purges, mass voter challenges, you're seeing it around the country, right? Because it really feeds into this idea. They can take their crappy database and take it to the BOE, and just the lodging of it gives them a fact. We lodged a challenge of X amount of votes. It doesn't matter how crappy that data is, how bad that spreadsheet is, how inaccurate or whatever. It just gives them a talking point. This is as much about communications as anything else. But let's flip aside. You send out challenge letters to voters. That doesn't just impact that voter. If I were to get a challenge letter, I'd talk to my family about it. I would talk to my colleagues about it. You're spreading this poison of voter suppression into communities when you do that. People go and talk about it at their churches. Like, what is this challenge voting, right? And creating this bar. And so many folks are already like, I don't even know if I'm going to bother voting. And then they get the letter, they're like, well, forget that, right? And so there's so many different elements to this on why I believe this is a strategy they are significantly ramping up this year, because I think it serves a set of purposes on the chilling effect, on the confusion, on the jamming up of elections offices, which is one of their stated on the record goals. There's a great Guardian article about it, about Eagle AI, that they're part of their thing is to give just a bunch of work to these boards of elections, and then in the post-election. And as Mary said, Fair Fight, there are three things about voting: getting registered and staying registered. It goes after that. Accessing the ballot, right? And that's where all the Dropbox and vote by mail changes. And then having your vote counted. And so this gets two of the three pretty directly.
Right. Okay. Hair on fire. David asks, are these being challenged in court? You mentioned that you and Mark Elias have a suit. We talked about it a little bit when you guys came last time, but tell us about that court case against True the Vote.
So part of how we view litigation is it's a tool like any others. The courts are not friendly to voting rights cases. After Brnovich, and going back further, obviously Shelby, we've seen a lot of really bad decisions on the right to vote. And so we have chosen to appeal our case in the 11th Circuit. It was in trial last year. My lawyer's actually in the room. I just looked over at her. I was like, all the years merged together, Kitty.
Sure do, Lauren.
The judge found, it's a really powerful opinion. He did not grant our relief, though, but he said that he found the actions intimidating. He found it all credible, but essentially, because of Brnovich, he didn't issue any relief, right? Brnovich is the last Supreme Court decision that has really severely hampered our right to see relief in the courts. And
remind us what Brnovich said. I know I should know this, but I don't.
Allegra, can you remind us all what Brnovich said?
Allegra, help out.
I'm going to give you the best legal.
Amen.
So Brnovich really redid the standards of proof under the Voting Rights Act. So pre-Brnovich, we had various standards that we've been using for years in these cases, and that, it wasn't that every case met them, but that they were quite reachable. And there were many, many cases that met them. Brnovich raised the standard significantly and really changed the entire calculus for everyone on these cases. And of course, that happened while we had a case pending, and has just really tied the hands of these district court judges since the Brnovich opinion. So, Dobbs got all of the attention, of course, but Brnovich has been really devastating in the voting rights world. What you have seen from many, many of the courts is them saying, if this case had come before me before Brnovich, right? I'm so troubled by these facts. These judges have been very explicit by how troubled they are. Here, in the case that Lauren just talked about, Judge Jones called the mass challenges reckless and said that they were intimidating, but that basically Brnovich tied his hands. And we've seen that from courts throughout the 11th Circuit and other places throughout the country.
Allegra,
All right, that was not planned, everybody, but the
No,
lead
I know.
litigator against True the Vote happened to be with me, and she rolls with the punches really well. So
Yeah.
she's an incredible voting rights expert going back to Bush v. Gore. So
would passing the Freedom to Vote Act or the John Lewis Voting Rights Act override Brnovich?
100%. Well, and
Okay.
like going like this. No, here a couple of things. Number one, this recent bill would have had to be pre-cleared. It would have had to go through pre-clearance had the Voting Rights Act been renewed. And then number two, had Freedom to Vote been passed, mass challenges were explicitly banned, the practice. And so Allegra's got an additional point.
And I'll just add one additional piece is that, remember, Brnovich interpreted the Voting Rights Act. So those standards of proof are the ones we're stuck with right now until we get new legislation. But new legislation presumably would create standards of proof in a very explicit way that would not be such a high bar, right? Those of us who do this work believe that Brnovich was designed to limit our access to the courts. And so legislation would be designed to open that access back up.
I mean, Allegra, your timing is impeccable. I just want to say, amen.
You know, we're called Fair Fight for a reason. We're always fighting. And today we're down here fighting in Savannah.
I want my constitutional lawyer to just hop into my room whenever I have a question. Love it. I definitely want to get back to some questions in the chat. Diane Robertson has given us some information about North Carolina. She's doing a lot of this in North Carolina. Will you be working in other states, Lauren, besides Fair Fight? What's your game plan in 2024?
Yeah, thank you for the question. So we are almost ready to go big. We'll make sure the
You're a little quieter now, Lauren. You've got to.
Okay, hold on.
Yeah. Okay. Better.
Better?
Yeah.
We are very shortly going to be going turbo blast on a national 50-state effort with a couple partners to help get people into roles to help shore up our democracy. So we will be letting Big Tent know probably in advance when that is coming so that you all can participate. We are doing a couple strategic partnerships. And the number one most important thing for all of us to know is that we got to get in the game. It's not a big secret that there's not a lot of enthusiasm this year, that people are hemming and hawing over their choices. This community knows this is a critically important election. So we're going to ask our friends and allies to really start organizing to get people to take action in their own states, as well as in all the top targeted races and issues around the country. So we're going to make it really easy for folks to do that. And then 4 years ago, we ran a ton of program in all the battleground states. Our role this year is a support role. In Georgia, we're running a ton of program. So around the nation, we're a support, technical assistance, coalition builder, and then helping put people into the pipeline. So that is our mission this year. And then tying together all of these cases like Kitty and Allegra just did on why everything that's happening this year needs to explicitly and clearly be connected to the absolute critical need to get federal voting standards and a new Voting Rights Act. And so you all have a lot of power on that. So you should feel free to tweet after this. Just heard from Fair Fight Action, and what's happening in Georgia and around the nation would not be able to happen had Congress done its job. We got to win these elections so Congress can do its job, so that we can do two things in the first 100 days of a 2.0 Biden administration, which is protect abortion access and healthcare access in this country. And the 1A and 1B is then get a new Voting Rights Act passed and some federal voting standards. Those are mission critical.
Yes, 100%. Okay, so before we have to wrap up really quickly, because I'm so glad you're going to be everywhere. That's very heartening to hear. And I want to make sure people will take a look at what you're doing and support you. So the link is in the chat. We'll put it in again before we wrap up. But I do want to just get a sense of what is going on the ground in Georgia, particularly around abortion. Before the call, you and I were talking about how your 6-week ban of heartbeat bill, which one of the guys who's come out is going to vote for Biden was the author of Lieutenant Governor Duncan, who I was like, now I gotta like you, but
You don't have to
appreciate
like
what he's
him.
okay,
But
but I
yes.
appreciate what he's saying.
He's
I really
awful.
do. But he was one of the authors of the heartbeat bill. So how are women in particular feeling around Georgia? What's your sense of how abortion is going to play in 2024?
Yeah, I think it's a really big question. Those of you who are working on some of these abortion ballot initiatives around the country, we don't have those here in Georgia or in any of the traditional southern states so we don't have that kind of direct democracy. Which means I think we know it's a very important issue. We know that the impacts are massive in Georgia in terms of not just OBGYNs, but anesthesiologists and others not coming here to practice medicine. And so it's not just impacting women, but it's impacting everybody in the healthcare system because our residency programs are just, we're not seeing the interest in Georgia and other states with these draconian bans. It's a big, big problem. And then we have the sort of double whammy of a heartbeat ban, a heartless ban, combined with the lack of expansion of Medicaid, which means we've had a lot of South Georgia rural hospital closures and also Metro Atlanta hospital closures. In fact, it hit really home for me personally in 2022. The closest level 1 trauma center to my house shuttered in 2022, in large part because of the sky-high uncompensated care costs, and likely could have been mitigated or prevented had the governor expanded Medicaid. So now our state of 11 million only has 1 level 1 trauma center. So if you get into a bad burn or a shot, it is despicable, it's unacceptable. And you combine all of that with the heartbeat ban, it's a real healthcare crisis. We've had more than a dozen hospitals close. It's not good. And so healthcare, I do expect to be a big issue. I think the question is going to be what, in a couple of months, are so many top of mind issues for folks. What ends up being the most salient, I think, is going to be the big question. But we certainly know this is the conversation with women who are thinking about starting a family, people who have women in their life, and how this is going to impact. So I think it's a really big deal. And I think Kemp has not paid any kind of political price for it, even though this has been his baby, pun intended.
Yeah, we have Caroline Aiken has joined us from Georgia. She said, women feel dread here in Georgia. The profile appointed by Kemp Supreme Court Justice just won election, and he threw 600,000 people off of Medicaid.
Yeah, it is not great. And the governor here has really benefited from the largesse of the federal government and the stimulus packages going back years. So he's had the benefit of a really strong Biden economy, 2 great senators in Warnock and Ossoff, while he has been able to pass all of his right-wing pieces, but he gets a moderate pass because he stood up to Trump. So it's a very tough situation here overall, but that is also why I don't sleep on Georgia in terms of the fall. I think this is going to be a close race. And then we have a lot of really important things down ballot with state legislative races in particular. Okay.
Well, we'll keep coming. We'll get you to come back, Lauren. Last question before we have to drop. I'm interested just to hear how you're going to be countering disinformation, which we know in Georgia really targeted Black voters in 2020 and in 2020 in the runoff as well. Rural voters, low information voters, like what's Fair Fight seeing and what are you doing about that?
Yeah, this is really important conversation. So in the 2021 runoff, Fair Fight Action's anti-disinformation program, we know, pulled about 80,000 Black Georgians out of disinformation networks. We had a really robust project. That project has now spun out into its own effort called Onyx Impact. And it's working with the Disinfo Federation and all of those groups that many of you are familiar with to be the first project mapping Black voter disinformation nationally. And so we continue to work with that organization. On our own direct program front, is one of the most important ways to disrupt these networks and get good messaging out is to have trusted influencers talking to folks, not politicians, not even Fair Fight, though Fair Fight, we get to a certain tier of folks. But we have an engagement with a set of Georgia influencers with big networks to help disrupt and pull people out of those networks, and then some strategic partnerships, because this is going to be like wildfire in terms of the bad actors domestically and foreign interference that we're already seeing in some of these negative disinformation narratives that are both nationwide and then specific to Black voters and specific to Georgia voters. So yes, this is top of mind and directly connected to all these conspiracy theories on voting, and then the kind of activities we see day to day in from the MAGA folks, and how they sort of put into the internet the poison around the pro-voter side of it as well.
Yeah. We've got a lot to do. We've got a lot to do, but it sounds like,
can I say one thing that Gilda is
please,
asking
yes.
about? Like, is
Yeah.
it too late? No, it's not too late. This is not new. One of the things I want to remind everybody with the history is, because this is not new, this is just like a different year, a different flavor. This is what we're all collectively used to dealing with. It doesn't mean it's easy and doesn't mean it's wrong. But just because it's hard and just because we're up against a coordinated, really cynical, mean, racist strategy doesn't mean that we can't persevere and will not persevere. I mean, the story of here and of our nation and of the South is one of continuing to fight, right? This is just the story of America. It's just a different chapter. It's just a different day. It's the same story, right? It's the same story. So sometimes when I'm feeling really despondent, I just remember, like, this is just what we fight in America. We fight a small radical group of anti-democratic folks who really do not like this multiracial democracy we're all trying so hard to build, and that is the story of our country. So we're not despondent. We have our moments, but for the most part, we're not despondent. We have an incredible organization, incredible allies, incredible voters, and incredible activists. And so I know many of you have supported so many of our great organizations down here and Fair Fight. So thank you for that. Keep supporting. We need your funds. We need your activism. Do not take this briefing to be discouraging. Take it as a call to action on they're fighting really hard. So we have to fight really hard too. We're going to fight harder, and we are on the right side of it.
That's right. We are. And we will make sure that we promote those great calls to action for people who don't live in Georgia. And also, if people want to do the more work, like you were talking about with sharing the stories of voters. So I just want to say thank you again so much, Lauren, for coming. We're very